Welcome back to the channel. Today we're reading Taking Hold by Francisco Jiménez, chapter 19, Within Reach. If you're following along, that's on page 148. I felt ready. A year had passed since I'd completed my master's degree and coursework for the PhD, and now I was set to take my comprehensive exams for the doctorate. I filled out the petition and went to see Professor Shearer in his office for his approval and signature. After looking at my academic record carefully and signing the petition, he said, "Looks like everything is in order. Good luck." I thanked him and waited for him to say something about the exam. Anything that would help me better prepare for it. He stared at me as though wondering why I was standing still there. I broke the awkward silence and asked, "Could you please give me some idea on what area or areas would the exam will focus on? You must know and able to evaluate critically Spanish literature from the time of Adam and Eve to the present," he said, chuckling. I felt blood rushing to my face and my head pounding. "Seriously," he said, "focus on your field of specialization. Latin American literature. However, you should have a general knowledge of Spanish peninsular literature too." I was relieved but annoyed and frustrated by his humor. I feigned a smile, thanked him, and left. The comprehensive written exams were not as difficult as I thought. I was given 2 long take-home essays, one on Simon Bolivar, letter to the Ecuadorian poet Jose Joaquin Olmedo, and one on Mariano Azuela classic novel Los de Abajo. A week after I turned in my essays, which I passed successfully, I took the oral exams with Professor Shearer, Duarte, Jiménez, and Sobejano in the department's conference room. I felt less nervous and more confident than I did when I took the orals for the masters, as I had already gone through the process once and was better prepared. Once again, I sat at the end of the long rectangular table facing Professor Shearer, who presided over the exam. Professors Jiménez and Duarte sat on my right, facing Sobejano on my left. Each of them took turns firing questions based on their own areas of expertise, which meant that half of the exam dealt with Spanish peninsular literature, 1/4 with Latin American literature, and the rest with history of the Spanish language. They seemed pleased with my performance, especially Hyungmin, whose questions I answered correctly without hesitation. "You did better this time," he said. The exam lasted an hour and a half, and after it was over, I was asked to step out of the room while the faculty deliberated. Within minutes, Professor Shearer came out and asked me to return. "You are now a certified PhD candidate," Professor Shearer said. "Congratulations." When I first arrived at Columbia, he had told me that as far as the department was concerned, I did not exist until I had passed the doctoral comprehensive exams. I felt like telling him I am not invisible anymore, but simply said, "Thank you. I'm glad it's over." Professor Duarte gave me a warm hug and whispered in my ear, "Excelente, Panchito." "Gracias a usted." "Thanks to you," I responded. Laura and I celebrated. We had a steak dinner with a glass of wine at home and enjoyed a delicious chocolate cake she had baked. The next day we splurged and went to Manhattan to see Garcia Lorca's play, The House of Bernarda Alba, which was playing off Broadway. Now that I was a doctoral candidate, I faced the daunting task with Professor Duarte's guidance of selecting a topic for my dissertation. Dissertation. I felt overwhelmed by the idea of writing a book-length study that had to be original and contribute to my field of concentration. Before meeting with Professor Duarte, however, I wanted to have a clever idea about what I wanted to research. I recalled that several older graduate students in the Spanish PhD program had been working on their doctoral dissertations for several years and were still not finished. I looked for a topic that would excite and engage me over time, knowing that it would take many, many months to do the research and many more to do the writing. I spent days thinking about specific themes and authors I had studied. The course on the literature of the Mexican Revolution, which in part dealt with the identity of Mexico and its struggles to come to terms with its indigenous past, kept coming to mind. Prior to the revolution, the Indians suffered injustices and were left out of Mexico's mainstream social order and culture. The society was not inclusive. I compared that unfortunate reality to the history and segregation of blacks and Mexicans and the discrimination against them in our own country. It was clear that the United States was not an inclusive and just society either. I thought of my experiences in grammar school, high school, and college, and I asked, were there any groups missing from the literature we studied during the time? As I considered the question, the answer became clear. Black and Mexican Americans and other minorities were either not included or not well represented in any of the literary works we read in school. I thought of the dramatic skits performed by Teatro Campesino during Cesar Chavez's march to Sacramento, and their later performances in New York City in support of the great boycott in California. As a result, I became intensely interested in doing my dissertation on some aspect of Mexican American literature. I wanted to explore and study works written by Mexicans and their descendants living or having lived in the United States who wrote about their experience in our country. I went to see Professor Duarte during his office hours on Wednesday. After teaching my afternoon class and proposed the topic to him, he was sympathetic but discouraged me from pursuing it. He felt that the university would not consider the subject a legitimate topic of study. He pointed out that even Latin American literature of Spanish-speaking countries of the Western Hemisphere was not considered a subject suitable for a PhD at Columbia until the 1920s. Up until then, only doctoral dissertations in Spanish Peninsular literature of Spain were accepted. To my dismay, I discovered that this bias was common among doctoral granting institutions nationwide. I was deeply disappointed and troubled by it, but I appreciated and respected his advice. As an alternative, he suggested writing my dissertation on Victoriano Salado Alvarez's historical novels, Episodios Nacionales Mexicanos, National Mexican Episodes. When I told him that I knew very little about this Mexican author, Professor Duarte proceeded to tell me that Salado was born in Teocaltiche, a small town for a few miles north of San Pedro Tlaquepaque, the place where I was born in the state of Jalisco. This caught my attention. He indicated that Salado had published a collection of short stories and numerous books on various subjects ranging from literary criticism to Mexican history. But his best-known work was the Episodios Nacionales Mexicanos, a history of Mexican in novel form covering the period from Santa Anna's rule to the end of the French intervention in 1851 to 1867. No one has done a study on this important work, he said. This piqued my interest even more. Since Mexican history and literature were two passions of mine, I agreed with Professor Duarte's recommendation. He was pleased as I was leaving his office. He said, I'm sure you'll enjoy reading the Episodios Dios Panchito. Read them when I was in the preparatoria. They got me interested in history. On Saturday afternoon, Laura and I went to the Americas bookstore in Manhattan to look for a copy of Salado Episodios Nacionales Mexicanos. I was not optimistic about finding it, but because the first edition was out of print, and according to Professor Eduardo, the only other edition published in 1944 was rare. I had been to the store several times to buy books for my classes. The old, musty space had wall-to-wall shelves, jam-packed with books on top of books, many covered with dust. There were stacks and stacks of paperback and hardbacks everywhere, including in the aisles, which made it difficult to get around. They seemed not to be placed in any particular order. However, Mr. Molina, the owner, appeared to know exactly what books he had, and generally where they were located. I asked him if he had the episodios. Look around. I think I have a copy, he said. I'll be right with you. He adjusted his baggy pants, rolled up his shirt sleeves, and climbed onto a stack of books, reaching to get a volume from a top shelf for an impatient customer. There were several people ahead of us who were also waiting for him. Laura and I began our search. We spent a long time plowing through hundreds of dusty books, but found nothing. Mr. Molina finally joined us in our hunt. I know they're here, somewhere, he said. Several minutes later, I heard Laura's faint voice coming from behind one of the tall, freestanding bookshelves. Episodios Nacionales. You're kidding. Don't fool around, I said loudly. She came around the corner, smiling from ear to ear and holding in her hand volume 1 of Episodios. She had found the 14th volume paperback second edition, published in 1945. Laura and I hugged each other. I can't tell you who's happier. You or your wife, Mr. Molina said, laughing. I purchased the collection for $30 that evening. I read the first half of volume 1, wrote notes in the margins of every page, and underlined passages. It was only the beginning, and that is the end of chapter 19. Hope you enjoyed it, and tune back in for more.